Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming out on this rainy night. We have a very warm and wonderful evening planned for you. I'm Lynn Marsden Atlas, Executive Director of the Arthur Ross Gallery and also the University Curator. Oh, thank you. I'm going to ask you all to silence your phones before we begin. Welcome to the third Susan T. Marx Distinguished Lecture at the Arthur Ross Gallery, and I'm delighted to welcome tonight our speaker, David C. Driskell, artist, professor, curator, and scholar of African and African American art. David's extraordinary career has spanned nearly 7 decades, and his many honorary degrees and national awards attest to his seminal role in the arts. I first met David on January 8, 1989, at the opening of his exhibition at the Colby College Museum of Art, where I worked. After the celebratory dinner, David and his wife Thelma, as all intrepid Mainers do, insisted on traveling 2 hours in perilous ice and snow to the Portland airport to fly home to Baltimore that night. David had to teach his students in the morning at the University of Maryland. Maine has been an important inspiration for his art since the summer of 1953, when David received a scholarship to study at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in Skowhegan, Maine. In 1961, the Driscolls purchased a small cabin and land in Falmouth, Maine, where they return each summer. Over the years, David and I have had several opportunities to work together in curatorial and artistic roles, and it has been a great honor for me. In 2018, the Arthur Ross Gallery celebrated our 35th anniversary year. We welcomed over 12,250 visitors from around the world, and we offered 103 public and exhibition-related programs, several of which included Philadelphia artists, musicians. Graduate and undergraduate interns learn museum best practice through curatorial seminars, internships, as docents, and as members of the Student Advisory Board. Our professional staff mentors and trains the very next generation of scholars and museum professionals. Engaging Minds Through Art, our educational outreach program that began almost 25 years ago, has doubled its programs to underserved Philadelphia public and parochial elementary school students, providing a unique program of inquiry and hands-on that's entirely supported by grants from Philadelphia foundations. Some exciting new events and initiatives that have happened just since the first of the year. We are expanding our new advisory board that was founded last year by 3 new members this spring. And I have some announcements of 3 major gifts that came in recently. The David J. Evans III gift, major gift to fund the David J. Evans exhibition program, underscoring and sponsoring 3 exhibitions in the next year and a half, and the David Evans Family Artist in Residence program to bring an emerging or mid-career artist to campus. And we'll have 2 of those. Bill and Kathy Hones funded a 5-year gift for the Hones Family Escape program that underwrites a digital student media intern every year and supports programs organized by the gallery's Student Advisory Board. And a new board member, Betsy Kleeblatt, has given a major gift in honor of our board chair, Andre Dombrowski. From outstanding exhibitions, artists, musical performances, conversations, films, opening symposia, yoga in the gallery, art reset, and First Wednesdays, 12 at 12. Please join us and discover or rediscover the Arthur Ross Gallery. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter too. Tonight, I extend my heartfelt thanks to Susan T. Marx and her husband, Philip Kivitz, and welcome her family who's here tonight. In December of 2016, Susan made the dream of a distinguished lecture series a reality for the gallery. Through this annual lecture series, Susan Marx and the Arthur Ross Gallery seek to inspire Penn students across disciplines to develop an interest in art and a passion for art, and to attract a regional and national audience. Funding for the Susan T. Marx Distinguished Lecture Series is provided by a gift to the University of Pennsylvania from Susan to fund the lecture series over 5 years. I would also like to welcome and acknowledge tonight a few special guests. Mrs. Janet Ross, who is with us this evening from New York. Bridget Moore, my wonderful colleague and friend for many years, who's the principal of D.C. Moore Gallery, and Julie McGee, who actually wrote the monograph that I have here on David C. Driskell, artist and scholar. And Julie's a great colleague from both Bowdoin and now the University of Delaware. In just a few moments, we will welcome Dr. Anita Allen, Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs, and who is just a great supporter of the gallery, and we call her the super champion of the arts at Penn. And in concluding, I'd like to thank my staff, Heather Muktaderi, Meg Pendoli, who may still be outside doing reception, and Sarah Stewart for their assistance with this very special evening. And please join us immediately after, following the lecture, for a reception, and you'll follow the crowd. It's about a block away at the Arthur Ross Gallery, where you can greet the artist and enjoy our current crowdsourced exhibition curated by Heather Muktaderi, Citizen Salon. Thank you. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Susan T. Marx.
So actually, good evening, everybody. It's so wonderful to see this large crowd on a rainy evening, and we're having indoor sunshine tonight with our wonderful speaker. Lynn actually said it all, but I do want to tell you a little bit about the origins of this lecture series. Many years ago, back in the 20th century, as an undergraduate at Penn, majoring in political science and international relations, I was able to take several history of art courses. For me, it was a magical experience and opened my eyes to a new world. Since that time, art has had a very profound impact on my life, both art appreciation as well as creating art, which I do as a serious amateur stone carver. So in giving back to the university, I wanted to spark a spark in today's 21st century students, hoping to inspire them across a variety of disciplines to develop an interest in and a passion for art. We're hoping to attract a wide audience locally, regionally, and nationally for the wonderful Arthur Ross Gallery. Based on tonight's turnout, I think that we are succeeding. And I just want to hand the mic back over to Lynn, who's going to introduce Dr. Allen, and of course, our wonderful speaker.
All right, I'm going to introduce very briefly Anita Allen, who is our Vice Provost again, and our great champion of the arts at Penn. Anita.
Hi, everybody. So my job is just to welcome you on behalf of the Office of the Provost. The Arthur Ross Gallery is one of our Provost centers, and we're very proud of the work that the Arthur Ross Gallery and Lynn Marston Atlas do, and also extremely happy with the partnership we now have with Susan Marx. So it is an extraordinary honor to have David Driskell here with us today as the third annual Susan Marx Lecturer. Professor Emeritus Driskell is one of the world's leading authorities on African and African American art. And I have to confess that I really love African American art. And I was married to an African American artist, first husband. But even though the first husband has been gone now for over 30 years, the passion that I have for African American art remains. So I'm particularly excited, Professor Driskell, to listen to you tonight and to better explore your artwork. Professor Driskell has excelled as a painter, a printmaker, a professor, a public speaker, an author, an African American art collector, and a curator, jack of all trades in the arts. And we heard that he has a very special connection with the state of Maine because of his experience at Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture that dates back to 1953, and because of his wonderful house that he bought in 1961 in Falmouth, Maine. And so Maine can claim him, but also Maryland can claim him because of his relationship with the University of Maryland. And Washington, D.C. can claim him because he went to Howard University and also to the Catholic University. And the state of Georgia can claim him because he was born in the state of Georgia, as was my father, and my mother was also born there in the same year that you were born. In terms of your artwork, David, I think that you're best known as a painter. Is that fair to say? Yes. And his paintings are intense explosions of color, light, nature, spirit, music, and people. His artwork is in a collection of many museums around the world. One of his most famous pieces, which is called Behold Thy Son, is on display in the new Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., and this artwork is a response to the tragic 1955 murder of Emmett Till. Professor Driskell holds 13 honorary doctoral degrees, 3 Rockefeller Foundation fellowships. He was awarded the NEH National Humanities Medal by President Bill Clinton. And in 2001, he was the honoree of a new center at the University of Maryland called the David C. Driskell Center for the Study of the Visual Arts and Culture of African Americans and the African Diaspora. Lynn referred to a book written about Dr. Driskell, but there are also books written by David Driskell, including Narratives of African American Art and Identity and The Other Side of Color, African American Art in the collection of Camille and Bill Cosby. I don't know if any of you had a chance to see the show, The Cosby Show, in Washington a couple of years ago. It's a fantastic, brilliant show. Whatever you might think about Bill Cosby as a person, the art collection is superb and well worthy of the talents of someone like David Driskell to interpret it. Books written about David Driskell include this one, which was mentioned earlier, David Driskell, Artist and Scholar by Julie McGee. There's also, and this book, by the way, chronicles his education, his artistic development, and so forth. There's another book called Evolution, 5 Decades of Printmaking by David Driskell, written by Childs Fine and others. So there's a wealth of scholarship out there by and about David Driskell. I think that one of the most important things that he has done for us is to help America understand that African American art is a thing. I mean, it takes, the younger people may not appreciate this as much as us old folks do, but it takes scholars to frame reality, to make it real. And what David Driskell did in the 1970s and 80s and 90s is to encourage us, to enable us to see African American art as its own genre or set of genres, and then to understand its value. So thank you very much for that just incredible service that you've done to art history and art curation. Committed to equality on the basis of race, gender, and ethnicity, David Driskell has been an important resource as museums have now begun finally to seek to become more inclusive in their acquisition. So who do we acquire? What should museums be acquiring? Well, the work that David Driskell has done has helped to identify those superb African American and African artists meriting the collections of the best museums in the country and the world. So on behalf of the Office of the Provost, we very, very much welcome David to Penn and look forward to his remarks. Thank you very much. Are you gonna?
Thank you so very much. Thank you, Dr. Allen. Thank you very much for inviting me to come to the University of Pennsylvania to share with you some ideas about my own art. As someone said a little while ago, I'm always talking about other people's art. So hopefully I'll be able to give you some insight into my own creative work, why I do it, how I do it, et cetera, et cetera. And like most artists of my generation, which is way, way back, we came up through what we call the academic process. And that involved our being able to look at the world a certain way, to look at form in a particular way, so as to give our own interpretation of that which we see, that which we experience, but most importantly, that which we feel. Without the feeling of the artist, we would be lacking in so many ways, in that we would be looking at what might be referred to as a camera version, and that has nothing to do with, it does not take photography out of the category of the artist, because the eye and the hand of the photographer, they are just as essential to the making of a work of art as the brush or whatever medium you are using to interpret your work. But that vision which the artist has of seeing beyond the contour, seeing beyond the shape of content, is something that is special and I think awe-inspiring, and that is what sets us apart from other people who may be just as creative, but may not put down exactly what it is that they feel in their hearts and their soul, in the mind's eye. So what I want to do this evening is share with you a personal account of some of my own artistry. I might call it a visual dialogue of sorts with myself, in which I have drawn and written and, of course, created paintings which chronicle aspects of my own involvement as an artist over the years, the travel that I've done, the homemaking that my wife and I have done, the gardening that I have done, and I'm an avid gardener, and trying to see another view of the world and give that view to you through my own eyes and my own hand. I was greatly influenced by my teachers at Howard University in the 1950s, who felt that it was important to look at yourself, see what was on the inside, and you have two portraits here. One, 1953, when I was a junior at Howard University, and the second one a few years later when I considered myself a little more mature. And this notion of self-examination for the artist is very important. It doesn't mean that every artist has to do a self-portrait, but I thought it might give you some notion of where I have been with my own work, where I am now, etc. Now, this notion of who we are and what we are probably goes back many, many centuries in examining our own perspective of art and trying to give a notion of where we've been, who we like, and what have you. And this sketch that you're looking at is a view of a windmill in Holland in 1964 when I was studying there. I was teaching at Howard University at the time, but I had a fellowship to study at the Netherlands Institute for the History of Art in The Hague. And so I was enamored by the work of Rembrandt, and I went from town to town. You know, Holland's not a very large country, so you can maneuver around the place pretty well. And so I went from place to place looking to try and see where is it that Rembrandt went, where did he draw, what did he do, and so forth. And so I had this fixation on looking at the various places where he had gone, and it's a little Dutch village. And this continued with my studies when I traveled to other parts of Europe. Here, the Church of St. George in Venice. That same summer, after I left The Hague, I took a tour of other European countries. And so what I'm showing you this evening is kind of an overview of some of my development as an artist, not so much of what I'm doing now, but what I have been through to get to where I am now. Now, artists being true to themselves, and there are a number of artists here in this room tonight, you know that you struggle with form. You struggle with the notion that you are attempting to capture the essence of something. And whether it be that which you're looking at with the physical eye, or whether it is that which you are perceiving in the soul, so to speak, all of those things are informed by your lifestyle. They're informed by your experiences. They're informed by your education. And the notion that you are not just standing in one place all of the time. The artist is an observer. When I was teaching at University of Maryland, I would very often, I taught drawing and painting. I would very often have my students, the very first day of class, put aside everything they were doing. And I said, let's take a walk on the campus. We're going to walk 2 blocks, and then we're going to come back and sit down. And I didn't say, look, but that's what I wanted them to do. I wanted them to see something. They were busy talking for the most part. And some would say, why would he want us to? We've seen these buildings before. We've seen this now. We get back to the campus after walking for 2 blocks, and I said, now I want you to write down, not draw this time, but write down at least 50 things that you saw in those 2 blocks. And the crowd, 50 things? I didn't see anything but buildings and 1 or 2 trees. I saw some people. No, you saw something else. You saw form in its evolutionary process. You saw things in nature that you overlooked. So the lesson is, as an artist, as an observer, whatever that gift or that calling that you have, if that's what you're going to do as an artist, you are in the wrong field, because you are an observer. You are a seer. You are a visionary. And you have the vision that somebody is depending on you to deliver to them. This has been true throughout the history of making. Now, for more than 40 years, I have kept these records of drawing every place I've gone. In some cases, in this case, to Africa, in Côte d'Ivoire, in a Sunuful village, talking to the people, at the same time doing sketches that would remind me of what happened there. And I very often try and not just do a sketch, but I include the writing, so later on I will have this as a visual diary of where I've been and what I've been doing. In Brazil, sometimes I forget the dates, but I think this was in 1983 or so. But looking at very quickly sketching the people in their various settings. The women, the Bahian women, this was in Salvador, Bahia, which is basically an African state in Brazil. And the people there carry their customs that are very much informed by their ancestry, which in many cases would be from Nigeria and from Ghana. And so the women very often on the streets are sitting there selling their crafts or the goods that they've made in the kitchen and what have you. And it's a very inspiring and interesting scene. And in other places that I have visited, I had the good fortune of knowing a number of very prominent African-American artists, one of whom was Elizabeth Catlett. And I know many of you know Catlett, her work and what have you. And in the 1980s, I would go down to Cuernavaca, Mexico, to visit her. And she would always have very interesting stories to share. And I would sit and absorb what she was saying, and sometimes I would sketch while she was talking. And if I didn't do it then in the evenings before I retired, I would then finish my drawings relating to the conversations or what have you that we've had. Now, a number of those books, diaries, or journals, are currently at the Driskell Center at the University of Maryland. One or two of them are in the special collection at the Library of Congress. Well, I tell you that to say that over the years, I have been involved with, let's go back to that one, I'm sorry. I've been involved with trying to see another side of life, to see what it is that makes me interested in the world in general. And so these drawings, to a certain extent, show me where I've been, perhaps even where I want to go, and some of the facts that I would have forgotten had I not jotted them down. Some of these scenes have been local, some have been national and international, and I use them very often to refresh my memory about the visual experiences that I've had, the narrative of this visit, of that visit, what have you. And so in making this overview available to you, I'm simply just running through a few things. This is another scene in downtown Salvador, Bahia, where the architecture was very much influenced by the Portuguese builders in the 16th, 17th centuries. But I'm looking at all of these things to inform my own artistry in certain ways. And I think I was very much taken to the notion that the artist has a very special calling in that he or she must be able to record in a particular way that which someone else may not see, that which someone else may not make. And when I was teaching, I would very often ask my students to read Dr. Joshua Taylor's little book called Learning to Look. And that book, it's not a formula, but it gives you some idea as to how to prepare yourself to see this wonderful world that we live in and not just take for granted even the smallest thing that is out there. Perhaps even a glimpse at something, or a glance, so to speak, or gaze. All of these things have meaning that will add up to memory. And memory is one of the things that the artist uses from time to draw upon. Memory is one of those things that the artist will also use to distinguish himself from another artist. And so very often there's the notion of, well, you know, in the classroom we're all painting still life. We're all out doing landscape. But when you look at what is being done, actually no two people would be doing the very same thing because they're seeing it differently. And that is what the artist does. The artist, the eye of the artist, is a distinguishing eye. It separates, it narrates, it calls out, and it brings to our memory the notion that the world is full of surprises. The joy of artistry I always speak of. And you may ask, well, why should I depend on the artist for such crucial information so as to help me define the world? Well, that is what the artist feels that his or her responsibility is. This is the world that you would not see otherwise. And think of what the world would be without this artistry. Think of, I'll just use the word drab, how drab the world would be if you didn't see that painting or that sculpture, that print, if you didn't hear that beautiful sound from the musician. Almost every time a musician picks up his instrument, he or she's going to bring us a nuance of sound that is so different from what you heard the very last time, even though he may be playing that same note. And so that is that variation on the theme, variation on sound, that variation on the human experience, which ends up being what we might call artistry. So as I said, without the keen vision of the artist to look beyond the ordinary, there would be no newness in the world. We would all be looking at the same thing. So the artist then becomes the ultimate interpreter. Writer, psychologist, scholar Rolla May said that God has entrusted humankind with the charge of wrestling with the angels when an artist picks up the brush or the pen or what have you. That the artist is just a little below the angels in his quest to define the world. So the artist, among other things, is the person who exercises descriptive cognitive skills when looking at visual phenomena. Variously, it reminds us of something that we want to see or something that we have seen. The observable fact, and fact in the sense that we are forever expanding upon the truths of seeing, the truths of seeing in the visible world. That painterly form that this artist comes up with is one that you haven't seen before. That sculptural form that the artist comes up with is one that you haven't seen before. And so that is the obligation of the artist, to expand upon the narrative which defines form in so many different ways. The next, please. And what you're seeing there are basically the sketches that come from the various diaries. The next. In some cases, sketches have been for studies of paintings and studies of works that will develop from one form into another, maybe in the form of a print, maybe in the form of a painting. Now, some artists, as many of you know, always sketch ahead of time exactly what it is that they're going to paint. Well, artists work in different ways. I very seldom go to the canvas and sketch what it is that I'm going to do. I may draw something from time to time, but in this journey of making, I very often will not just sit down and do what might be referred to as a study. You are looking at a study, a drawing on one side, which is an interpretation of the dance, and then on the opposite side, you see a collage painting, which is a finished work from the 1970s. And of course, it was not referencing the dance study that you see there, but I wanted to bring that to your attention, that that can be the situation. I like to think also that the mind of the artist is something that's malleable. It's very difficult to describe it. If you go back to the writings of the ancients, of Plato and Aristotle and others, they would say that this whole concept of how form comes about in the world, that it's very difficult to explain it. It's invisible in certain ways. Its origin is in the mind, or in the mind's eye, so to speak, but it is dependent upon knowledge and manual dexterity of hand, efficiency of causation and what have you, to deliver that particular work. And that's the only way that a work is delivered well so that we can have critical analysis. There has to be an understanding of the form. What is the origin of it? What is it that it's supposed to be doing? In what is referred to by Jacques Maritain, the French writer on the formation of art, it is said that there are stages of causation in the making process, so that everything begins with this idea in the mind. And that is also something that is very much in tune with what Plato said about the artist, the idea stage of things. And so you must have the idea stage of thinking about it. You may put it down on paper in the form of a drawing, an architectural drawing, a sketch, or something like that. But this is the formative stage. And you move from that to the notion that if you're going to create this work of art, what is it going to be made of? In this case, I have a collage. I'm going to gather materials to paste onto the surface of the painting. And here the wisdom of the artist must be taken into consideration. You choose the right material for making that statement. So that is what is called the material cause. And once you have done that, you look at this work and you try and examine the aspects of it to see how far can I go with it? What can I take away? What can I add to it, etc. So it's a dialogue that the artist is making all of the time. And so you will end up with what might be referred to as the efficient cause, because it will then tell you how well you can make this thing. And that's what's going to distinguish between the so-called good artist and the artist who does not know that his work is not good. So, because, I used to have the experience, and I'm sure every teacher and every artist who's been a teacher here, of students coming in and they look at the syllabus, but they tell you what they want to do. You say, well, I think you ought to go through this stage and do this. Well, they have in mind what it is that they want. And in some cases, the very first thing that these students wanted to do was abstraction. And I would say, well, that's good. We're going to get to that. But, you know, some cases it can't wait. I want to do abstraction. What are you abstracting from? What is your base of knowledge? What is the essence of form? Abstraction is the essence of form. It is a reduction to the very last degree of making. To the extent that you are satisfied with the color, with the form, with all the elements of design, without having to refer to the image. Now, are you there on that very first day? 9 times out of 10, the answer was no. So, the good teacher will be patient and will guide that student into that making process of showing the relationship of form in the recognizable sense to form in the abstract sense. And so that very often, you know, you've heard the notion, you know, I know members of my family go to like exhibits and they say, I could do that. Well, do it. Not that easy. I'm not talking about my nephew here. He doesn't. I have to have him working with me, so I won't talk about him. But, you know, this whole notion of what it is that the artist is doing, you're not going to make a living at all. Go into medicine, go into law, go into dentistry, go into an area. No. It's not so much about making a living as it is about making a statement about life. Art is that extension of life, which sometimes imitates life. But it is something that is informing, and that is what many of us have tried to do over the years. I have to remind myself that I'm not teaching, so I'll get off into these kinds of things. So bear with me. I'll get back to the art. The next, please. So as I said, the mind of the artist is always discriminating, deciphering, and defining form. This then implies that the artist's difference from that of the non-artist lies in the ability to make forms that give us a sense of connecting to the world of the visual phenomena. This discriminating, deciphering, defining notion. A sketchbook, this is a scene from a sketchbook, one of the African sketchbooks. I think this is from a Nigerian sketchbook in the 1960 of a Shango object. So the next one, we see these descriptions, then we start putting them together in the mind's eye. How is it that these things come together and become a definition for us of something that makes sense, visual sense? The visual sense is really the will of the artist, but the viewer then becomes the intaker. You become the person who will trust the vision of the artist. And so I would move from the sketches to the canvas, and these, the 1970s. And these canvases would then echo for me where I was, what I was doing, and in some cases, my own philosophy of life at that particular time. So in the 1970s, just beyond the civil rights movement and what have you, and I was living in the South at that time. And so there are all of these things that will come before us in the sense of how to negotiate the political scene, the social scene, and what have you, without becoming a social satirist, without becoming a social commentary artist. And so there are certain symbols that one might choose to use, the flag, or certain things that would remind us of the political scene. The next, please. In the 1970s, I started moving slightly away from the traditional canvas. And as I said, using collage. Of course, collage has been in use for many, many years, many decades. But one of my heroes, of course, was Romare Bearden. And I had the good fortune of knowing him as a mentor. And so I started trying to move my work away from the notion that I was so enamored by what Bearden was doing at that time, by adding on objects so that it becomes the assemblage in some cases. And that is what you see with the composition called Black Ghetto, where we have a book and other objects added to the canvas to move us away from just the plain notion of painting. On the opposite side, the work where it is principally a collage, which reminds us of a wall that is plastered with papers and paint and so forth. Somebody asked me about these works at one time, and I said, I am at a loss to process all of them at the same time as to what is going on in my mind, but I'm always struggling to keep up with the multiplicity of images that come to me in idea form. Then making a choice of which ones to keep and settle on those and others to discard, this becomes a very painful experience. I may sit up, for a long time trying to move this form over to that form to see if it's working and push it around and what have you. The notion of push and pull on the canvas. That notion is with the artist's eye and mind at the same time. The thought process, how ideas become concrete form, they all add measurably to this concept of representative form making or to the visualization of something. I am still in awe of how ideas that originate in the mind's eye make their way onto the stages of media. They come in so many different ways. And for most artists, I think, this notion that we can jot down and do everything that is in the mind's eye is a very troubling one. We can't get to all of the things that we want to do. We need several lifetimes to do it. And so we try and concentrate on that which is close to us and that which comes out of our own personal experiences. And here you are looking at works that have been influenced by my own religious experience, growing up basically in the fundamentalist black church. The stories, my father being a Baptist minister, would preach these glowing sermons. I remember as a kid, Jonah and the whale. And I would sit there with this imagination, not knowing that I was going to be an artist because I didn't study art until I went to college. But I would sit there with this imagination of trying to figure out what was it like? How long was he in the belly of the whale? And so forth and so on. And the same thing about Gabriel, the Archangel Gabriel, when the last requiem and so forth and so on. So that I am forever trying to resolve in the mind's eye and then the visualization of this subject that has appeared in literature, in biblical form, et cetera, et cetera. Then I go back to the journals and travel. This is 2008, traveling in China and making notes of what is there. But I want the writing to be part and parcel of this account so that it's not just a pictorial experience. I used to sit on the boards of different organizations, one, the National Endowment for the Arts, and others, and sometimes meetings get a little boring. And I would have my sketchbook with me. I didn't have my paints there, but I had my sketch, and they would catch me off guard sometimes. Professor Driskell, what do you think? And I've got to get back away from, I'm not thinking about what you're thinking about. I'm thinking about something else. And I'd get home at night, and then I'd fill in the spaces and what have you, so that I am not without the notion that I am continuously involved in this creative process, regardless to what I'm doing, where I am. And Lynn mentioned the notion of our living in Maine in the summer, since the summer of 1961. And just the beauty of the setting there. And I put a lot of emphasis on the summer. I didn't say winter, because, you know, it's quite different up there in the winter. But the majesty of the beautiful pine trees, and I took to painting pine trees when I lived in Alabama in the 1950s during the civil rights struggle and what have you. And I just decided that people had just pushed me so far away from looking at them as beautiful objects with segregation, Jim Crow, etc., that I just turned almost exclusively to nature. And so nature was there welcoming, not naming me, not discriminating, not asking me to be something I'm not. And so I became just enamored with these trees, these pine trees. And I still paint pine trees because they still have a wonderful meaning for me. But these trees, for the most part, in the vicinity of the house in Falmouth, and looking at what is it like, the experience of being out there with the breeze that's coming through the trees, or the moon that's coming up over the horizon, or what have you, and not seeing the tree the same at any one given time. It's always different. It's always changing. And the same with people, of trying to see people in their habitat. I grew up on a farm. My people originally were sharecroppers. And it was morning, noon, night in the fields, working. How you dressed depended on the weather and the season. And so a number of those images come back to me as I look back into time, look back into space of growing up in that experience. Then in the 1960s, I did a series of works that I called Americana, of looking at American furniture and chairs and the interior of houses and things like that. And so a number of these works are an indication of that kind of study. The chair has been an inspiration to me in so many ways, because I think of chairs as having such rich history. And I almost never sit in a decorative chair without thinking of, I wonder who sat here ahead of me. What were they like? What went through their mind? How is it that they negotiated this space? Did they interrogate this space? Did they sit here and just become comfortable? Or were they inquiring of how this chair, this relationship of me, thou, the chair? And so these subjects became important to me in certain ways. So you saw the pine again. Let's go on to another pine tree. And then the experience of travel, the African experience, also collecting African art and trying to bring it out of the notion that it's only for display, that we see the art out of its natural habitat. We display it in our homes, our museums, and what have you, but what is it like if it's being used in the forest? What is it like if it is being used as a vital part of society? And so a composition, Dance of the Mask, is interrogating that space, the kind of space that one would not normally see with the mask. And the same is true of this lithograph, Spirits Watching, which incidentally was printed here. It was created here in Philadelphia at the Brandywine Workshop. And Alan is here this evening. And I know that you know about the Brandywine Workshop, one of our great American institutions that has been fostering the progress of the graphic arts for many, many years. And so the use of the mask, as I have felt it, seen it, experienced it, collected it, etc., in this particular composition called Spirit Watching. Looking out in the fall in the state of Maine, and accent of autumn, and all but abstract interpretation of the beauty of the colors of the trees and what have you, so that occasionally one gets a little romantic about deciphering these beautiful forms. Almost always my return to the pine tree as a source of inspiration, but I go back to the evergreen as a source of energy, a source of light, and as a reminder that throughout history, almost every civilization that you go into, if the evergreen is used in any manner, it is always there to deal with the subject of everlasting. It's almost like the eternal notion of without change. And so that is also part of my orientation about this tree that gives up its life in little parts but remains alive, green, healthy. It's a lesson for us, an ongoing lesson in so many ways. Thanks. Graphic works, in this case, a hand-colored woodcut. Another woodcut. Back to the chairs again that I mentioned. And I was greatly enhanced knowledge-wise when somebody said to me on seeing these two chairs in an exhibition, the exhibition at the Smithsonian, and I was talking about the chairs and about the history of these chairs, of not just being objects, but having their own life span of what it was about these chairs. And so at the end of the talk, someone came up to me and said, you know, I've never thought of chairs as having a life of their own. I just sit in them. Well, you know, these things do have a life of their own, and they are related to us in certain ways. And so at the end of the conversation, the lady said to me, she said, well, you know what? I'll never sit in a chair again without thinking something about this chair. So I thought, well, okay, that was a teachable moment. The studio in Maine and the house, and I had a little addition built onto the studio, the red structure there, maybe 15 years ago, and the architect added it on to the back. Now, I built this part in 1967, and the floors have become a little unstable and a little warped and so forth and so on. And I obtained the windows from the town dump, where they used to allow you to come and pick up stuff and give them $1, and they were very happy. They don't let you do that anymore. And so the architect was saying to me, well, why don't you just let me tear this down and build you a nice modern studio? And I looked at him. I said, no, this is my architectural masterpiece. I've created some of my major works in here, and you have to add on to it. Can't let you tear it down. As they would say in Maine, can't tear it down. So it's still there. It's there in the woods, in the beautiful pines, surrounded by a very natural setting, and the vicinity of my garden, which I tend to daily. Sometimes I go to the garden before I go to the studio. And I have vegetables, flowers, fruit trees, peach trees. People say, peaches grow in Maine? If you let them, if you love them, if you cultivate them. So all of this, I'm simply saying, these things all fit into not a formula, but a way of life for me as an artist. It informs not only my physical aspect of living, but it also informs my spiritual aspect of living. It is that which gives me the chance to be close to nature, so that I feel that I'm part and parcel of this wonderful world that we are fortunate to have the experience of being a part of. So to a certain extent, that is what my journey in art is about. It is not always a philosophical one. It is not always one that can be defined by a definition from the textbook, but it is one that is personal, informing, and above all, one that I love. So thank you. Indeed, yes. Any questions? Yes. Pardon?
Who are some of your favorite artists, aside from the ones you've already mentioned?
Oh, besides the ones that I mentioned? Well, I think you can see the influences that in my art include Cézanne, Matisse. When it comes to the graphic side, certainly Elizabeth Catlett, Jacob Lawrence. And as I said, I feel very fortunate that I came along in that generational time when I overlapped with a number of those artists. And they took me into their confidence, and they took me into their mentoring care. And so I feel as though their spirit is still, to a certain extent, with me. Obviously, as you can see, when I went to Holland to study in the 60s, I was very much taken with the art of Rembrandt. And anecdotally, I'll just tell you a very quick little story. I was studying at the Netherlands Institute for the History of Art, and my project was on Rembrandt. And I would go one town to the other looking. I had a Eurail pass, and so I could leave The Hague and go to Amsterdam in 30 or 40 minutes in the evening, and I'll go to the Rijksmuseum or some such place and look at Rembrandt's work and so forth. But I'd go to the little towns, Arnhem and other such places, Delft, Utrecht, and so forth. And I kind of felt like I was reliving the experience of those artists. And I kept saying, oh, to one of my classmates who was from Denmark, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could find a Rembrandt sketch or a Rembrandt print or something? And she said, oh, David, please. Well, didn't find anything in Holland, but I went to visit her in Denmark. And I was walking down Kierkegaard, Church Street, in one of the areas where there are a lot of old shops, antique shops and what have you. And my eye sees something, and I look in this window, and there is what I thought was a restrike, a Rembrandt restrike. And I go in the shop, and I say to the gentleman, I said, is this a restrike? He said, no, it's a facsimile. This is 1964. Now, I had not heard the word used in that context. We didn't have any fax machines, so how was I to know what a facsimile was? He said, no. I said, well, what is a facsimile? He said, it's a very fine reproduction. I said, oh. I said, well, may I take it outside and look at it? He said, sure. And I took it outside, and I looked at it, and lo and behold, my eyes said, real. Wow. And I took it back in, and I said, so this is a facsimile. He said, yes. And said, well, how much is it? He said, $10. So then I became an expert on facsimiles, and I said, $10 for a facsimile? He said, but sir, it's a very fine reproduction. Well, my little mind's eye had told me, this is real. So I bought it, dashed out back to the hotel, called my friend who was a curator over at the Abstraction Museum in Denmark of prints and drawings. And I said, Mariana, I have my Rembrandt. And she said, oh, David, please. I insisted I had my Rembrandt. She said, well, bring it over in the morning. We'll take a look at it. I took it over. They took it to the lab. And the report came back. It said, this is a finer impression of the self-portrait on the windowsill. You know that particular work. This is a stone wall, rather. This is a finer impression than the one we own. So I thought, and Dr. Taylor, learning to look. And so I got my Rembrandt, and I still have it. I've seen it at auction for $80,000. Yes.
Let's speak about, in general, your feelings about museums. And today's museum, yesterday's museum, where it's going, you're going.
I have had a cold, so I have a little harder. Museums.
Museums.
Okay.
General.
Okay. General.
She was asking what you think of them, where they're going, how they've changed.
Okay.
Whatever.
All right. Yes. Museums, obviously, we need them. They're so important. for our chronicling history and understanding our relationships to history, museums have, I think, a critical role to play in our understanding of our human equation. And that, I mean, how do we fit into this definition of who we are, what our aims, objectives, and what have you. So they chronicle, they curate, the Latin word curatas, to keep, to oversee, etc. And so the museums have the responsibility of not only keeping that from the past, but keeping us involved in the dialogue with the past. Now, also, museums have the role and responsibility of keeping us current, of keeping us in tune with what is presently going on. And there are many omissions. There are many subjects that we could be talking about, and I, very often people have to quieten me down when I start talking about the omissions. They say, omissions? What do you mean? Omissions of women, minorities, etc., etc. And museums are improving. But in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., they haven't yet taken us to the promised land. They are existentially still evolving. And that's important, that they are. And that's why I think we look at what is happening with so many of the foundations that have real goals and objectives now, like Ford, Mellon, etc. They are looking at this formula of seeing the role of museums in contemporary life and education. And that is to expand upon the quality of life, but at the same time, deal with the question of equity and the equation that is inclusive of all. Yes, in the back.
It's great to have you here and to have good walk. But you have this characteristic when it comes to oral history and telling stories of living objects. And how did you come to have this kind of ability to tell stories?
I'm still having a problem.
How did you come to have the ability to tell stories?
Well, I grew up in an oral society, basically. I started out by telling you that my father was a minister, and ministers are storytellers. My mother was a quilter, basket maker, etc. I was born in Edenton, Georgia, a very rich African-American community in Edenton, Georgia. People very often say, Edenton, Georgia, why do I know about Edenton, Georgia? And I usually say, well, it's because Alice Walker came from Edenton, Georgia. You know, the color purple and In Search of My Mother's Garden and so forth and so on. But I always tell them, but I was born there before she was. So it's a rich tradition and the experience of growing up in a segregated South, attending a one-room school, elementary school, and then coming up through the ranks of having to be driven 35 miles a day to a four-room segregated high school, passing about 5 beautiful edifices with 50 or 60 rooms along the way that I couldn't attend because of the color of my skin. Not necessarily because I wasn't capable of learning in the same way. And so in that circumstance of being a sharecropper, and if had my father not been literate and able to count and read and write, we would have gathered nothing in the fall, because the overseer, the owner of the land, would have taken everything. But he had his own books, his mathematical equation. That, to a certain extent, is an education to itself. It is informing. This was in Appalachia, the poorest part of the country in western North Carolina. And when I went to this little four-room high school, we had great teachers, which was our salvation to a certain extent. And the teachers were the models. They were the role models. And they, along with my parents, said, as I announced that I am not going to be a farmer, and I'm not going to live here all of my life, etc. And they said, the way out of this is through education. And so, even when I finished high school in this little four-room school, and our teacher said, go to college, we had no counselors or what have you. I just went down to Kings Mountain, got on the train, and came to college. I came to Howard University 3 weeks after school had been in session, with my report card in my hand. And I walked into the registrar's office and I said, I'm here to go to college. And they looked at me as though I had come from Mars. And they like, what manner of child is this? I refused to give up. They said, you don't just come to college. You have to make an application. And I said, well, I'm here, give me one. And so the dialogue back and forth, I think they didn't know what to do with me because I wouldn't leave. I was going to college. And they said, well, school's been in session for 3 weeks. You can't, do you have any money? I said, no, I don't have any money. Luckily, I had 2 sisters living in Washington. And I had that kind of audacity and insistence on, you're going to make me into something. That's what you're here for. And they didn't call security. And that was that. So that's part and parcel of my story. Yes.